Hello everyone and welcome to the Love of Wisdom Book Club. This episode I am joined by Pierre and we speak about Cynical Theories by Helen, Pluckrose and James Lindsay. This book covers the history of postmodernist theory from its inception in the obscure reaches of academia up until the modern day iterations, which might not be immediately identifiable as postmodernism to most people who aren't familiar with the ideas. This is important because these theories have a big influence in society today. These theories meaning the group of theories often known as critical social justice or wokeism. So it'd be theories like critical race theory, queer theory, intersectionalist feminism, and the sort of theories that lay the foundations of fat studies and disability studies. There is a technical issue in this episode where Pierre's mic is going up and down in volume. It wasn't particularly noticeable while we were talking, and so we didn't pick up on it, but I've done my best in the editing process to mitigate the impact of that, and hopefully it doesn't detract too much from the listening experience. As always, this is a work in progress, so any feedback you have will help me greatly in improving the quality of the product I'm putting out and hopefully building this into a better, more useful show for people to listen to. On that note, I also am always looking for guests, so if you have a book that you would like me to read and you would like to discuss with me, then give me a shout and we can make that happen. Or if it's a book that I've already read, all the better, because we can make that happen quicker. But just let me know. My inbox is always open. I won't keep you anymore. I'll let you get on with it, so enjoy the episode. So, what did you think of the book?
Really valuable, actually. For me especially, I think the thing that I most take away from it is it's really helpful to have certain concepts clarified and put into these kind of conceptual models that are easier to then hold in your head. I definitely felt that with the phases of postmodernism and the idea about human identity operating at these three levels of the individual, the group, and the universal.
Yeah.
And how critical social justice sort of fetishizes that middle bracket and ignores the other two, whereas the liberal perspective wants to emphasize those.
Yeah, and I suppose in that case, in that framework, they're almost an inverse of each other, because the liberal to some degree de-emphasizes the group, and there's a good reason for that, and I sort of found very similar, because I mean you will probably have encountered this as well because you work in academia, but these ideas are very pervasive, and you see them in a lot of situations, and I see them both through university and work, cropping up on a regular basis, and I didn't necessarily know, they're not very coherent as to how they relate to each other at first glance. I can recognize a similarity to the framework of, say, critical race theory and intersectional feminism. I can see that they're coming from the same perspective, but to actually link those two together was very useful, and to see where the common root comes from. And so, are these things that you've been encountering in practice then? Have you prior to reading the book, because I believe this is the first time you read the book recently, is it?
Yeah, relatively recently. I've been aware, of course, of Helen, Pluckrose and James Lindsay for a number of years now, and listened to a lot of their content online and read articles by them and so on like this. But this particular book, no, I only read this recently. Although I have to say, can we just take a moment to appreciate the little genius of how the cover's been designed? Because I think this is such a nice touch with the rainbow sunglasses. I think it's conveys the message so well. There's kind of an element of trolling in it, isn't there? It's like
Yeah.
the internet meme of the sunshade coming down and saying, "Deal with it. We're in the business of murdering truth. Deal with it."
Yeah, well, I interpret it more as like there's this friendly, innocent image that's being used as a disguise, you know, what lies behind the sunglasses. And I thought that sort of played in with the crossing out of critical and replacing with cynical. I thought, to me, both those sort of symbolized, it's like it represents itself as this friendly thing, as critical theories and the pride flag, but actually when you scratch beneath the surface, there's something deeply cynical behind it. That's sort of how I interpreted it. But
You
so
asked me though. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent. You asked me, didn't
no,
you,
no,
what kind of aspects or how have I encountered this in my own life? So,
well, not necessarily in your own life, in whether you've seen it playing out in society, whether you've seen it playing out in the academy, wherever, whether it's personal or societal. Have
gosh,
you, where have you encountered it?
where do we fricking start? Um,
Sorry, a bit
it
broad
was,
question.
well, I'll tell you what, I'll outline some examples of avenues we can go down and then maybe we can pick one. So,
Yeah,
it was there in my undergraduate degree in English literature. And on reflection now, looking a little bit more at some of the figureheads of original postmodernism, I'm a little bit, I'm questioning now why exactly that needed to be the case, because they're not necessarily literary critics first and foremost. But anyway, on my undergraduate course, it's present in different areas of academia that I've been involved in. It's there in the discipline of history, for instance. It's there also in education, quite worryingly. And I've got some example articles that
yeah,
we can talk about later, you know, of that. And also in my workplace as well. So last year we had to do this so-called anti-racism, so-called training
yeah,
workshop, which was actually a recorded video with presentation slides that was about an hour long that we had to sit down and watch, and it was made mandatory for everybody in the school. And that included, well, that drew heavily from critical race theory. For that, it was entirely that, in fact, and that was very, very worrying when that you know, came into my life, and I was told that, you know, we were going to have to watch this and listen to this. Things have kind of gone quiet since then. Nothing's really being acted on at the moment in terms of everyday teaching practice. We're not being told we have to do X, Y, Z. But I'm worried that that's probably somewhere down the pipeline. So yeah, those are different areas where I've come across this in my own lived
yeah.
experience.
Well, good choice of language there. I've had a similar experience. I actually, in some ways, potentially have a unique angle to come on this, because I in my late teens, I sort of adopted that activist mindset and moved into a world where this critical social justice theory was the underpinning of everyone's sort of belief, you know. And this wasn't an academic world, it wasn't even necessarily an employment world. This was mostly sort of activists, punks, squatters. They would have called themselves anarchists for the large part, but so I very much bought into these ideas for a very long time, and in many ways it was the dawning realization of the underlying illiberalism to them that sort of brought me out of that, as I sort of started to realize, you know, these people claim to be all for respect and consideration and unity and against oppression and all these ideas, but there's a lot of trying to get one over on each other, who's the most radical, and tearing everyone down, and very negative, and a lot of conflict, and the juxtaposition between what they were saying and what they were doing started to grate on me to the point, and I slowly moved away from it. And it was a very long time, really, before I found the means of understanding that. It was something that I felt and I saw, but I couldn't articulate it. And it's only over the last few years that I sort of was able to complete that removal of myself from those sort of theories as I began to understand them. And I've had to attend many anti-racist trainings or lectures or seminars, everything over the past few years. And I always felt that there was something, there was something about them that just didn't sit right, even when I didn't necessarily understand it. Because in principle, you know, the idea of anti-racism, inherently, it feels wrong to me to object to anti-racism. And I think this is one of the tricks that's played, or one of the issues with these theories, is that because they pose themselves as being opposed to things that most people find objectionable, like racism, like sexism, that to then criticize the theories, they almost presume a de facto stance of being pro-racism or pro-sexism, which obviously isn't the case. And I mean, I can think of a very recent example, and by recent I mean 2 days ago, where I was on a team development day, and they got us all to stand in a line in the middle of a field, and they read out statements, and whether these statements were true to us or not, we had to step forwards or back depending on the statement. Yes, and these were about statements of privilege, and somewhat ironically, I ended up very near the back, despite how the intersectional matrix would presume me to place myself. But that's just the advantage of having grown up in another country and being beaten up for being English. It just turns things on its head a little bit. But no, and I was looking around, and I was like, this is so divisive in some way.
Yeah.
Because all it is just it's a literal act of distancing people from one another based on their group characteristics. And to give it its due, so one of my issues with intersectionality is not that I don't believe these groups, not that I don't believe people have more positive or negative experiences based on their identity and their circumstances. You know, the Heideggerian thrownness, you know, you are born into a situation with no real reason for any of the faculties that you're born with. You just are, and that's it. But that it arbitrarily chooses a number of distinctions to make, whether those are race, sexuality, sex/gender, that's a complicated theory aspect in itself, religion, and so on. And it divides people along these lines, but it never acknowledges that there are an almost infinite number of ways in which people diverge from one another. And part of the issue with that,
and therefore just privilege itself manifests itself in just as many diverse ways then, which don't get acknowledged.
Yes, exactly. And so this is sort of my defense of that privilege exercise that we were doing. They did include some more dimensions than a typical. One of them was like, are you the first person in your family to get a university education? Did your parents
were your parents separated or were they together? And like they did ask questions that went in a little bit more in depth than, you know, step forward if you're white, step back if you're black. It wasn't quite that simplified, because I think that's commonly known as segregation. But what disturbs me about these is they are accepted and presumed to be effective based on an ideological position. But when you actually look at the empirical data into them, implementing initiatives like this, like the mandatory anti-racist training, makes things worse.
Yeah.
There are some studies that find no impact whatsoever, in which case it's a waste of time anyway, but it's actively counterproductive in a number of studies. And I have yet to find a study that demonstrates a positive impact from them. And the reason is, and this ties in a lot with the social psychology literature. I'm thinking specifically of Henry Tarfel, but there's a few others whose names escape me at this moment in time, where when you emphasize group identity, then people tend to divide themselves according to those group identities, whether or not that's done by a distinguishable, immutable characteristic, or whether that's done on an arbitrary basis. You know, I remember reading one experiment where they had a certain number of dots on a page, and people were asked to guess how many there were, and then they were divided into groups of overestimators or underestimators. But they were divided arbitrarily. They weren't based on their guess to remove any sort of personality bias that might have split them up. It was just done arbitrarily, but they believed themselves to be underestimators or overestimators. And when you gave people a task to divide money between the two groups, people would give preferential treatment to their own group. And then I've read some other research that was done, I believe it was in Israel. I think the guy's name was surname was Jasper, but I'm not sure. Where they decreased incidents of racial tension by emphasizing an overarching identity rather than focusing on the individual differences between two groups. Not individual differences, the group differences between two smaller groups. And so it seems that this anti-racist training that is derived from these critical theories taps in to the human tendency towards tribalism and in-group preferences, and emphasizes it by emphasizing those group differences.
Absolutely, yeah. There are several things actually in what you were saying there that but there are several points that cross my mind in what you were saying. One is about the term itself, anti-racism, and I always, when I'm writing it down, I always tend to put quote marks around the anti part, even when it's just a note document that nobody else is going to see, because I'm that stubborn. I've got mixed feelings about this term. It irks me that even people who dislike critical social justice have adopted this term now. They've kind of accepted that linguistic frame. And I can understand why, you know, because they're trying to reach people who have bought into the idea of anti-racism. And if you just say non-racism or something like this, then there are certain people who aren't going to be persuaded now, unfortunately. But it does still bother me. I don't like accepting that linguistic frame. I can kind of understand a reason for it. You know, if you think about other things that are anti, you know, if the idea is to oppose and prevent racism, then, you know, we have other anti terms, don't we? We have antifreeze, antiperspirant. So in a sense, it does, you know, it is logical There is a way to justify it. But even so, even then, even acknowledging that, I still don't like it overall, partly because it's a diseased fruit of the loin of Ibram X. Kendi, the arch anti-racist himself, and partly because it's just such a low-hanging fruit. You know, Jordan Peterson has talked about anti-fascist before. I'm sure you've come across him remarking on this as well. It's like how self-congratulatory and complacent it is to label oneself an anti-fascist, you know, as if that warrants a Medal of Honor. Well, and it's the same with anti-racism, really. It's, to me, it indicates a kind of civilizational complacency that we now have, as a certain laziness.
Well, there is it makes me think of the stages that are laid out in the book of the development of critical social justice theory. In terms of, you had Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, and all of those French philosophers who sort of started it in the 60s, and then what Pluckrose and Lindsay define as the applied turn, that is when it becomes actionable, and the anti-racist thing is it becoming actionable? You know, that's when it comes into critical race theory, and it's, you know, it's to bring it to Ibram X. Kendi, who you mentioned. You know, he has that classic phrase, it's not enough to not be racist, one must be anti-racist. And that is the sort of, that to me is representative, although significantly after the time that this actually happened, of the applied turn, because that's taking these ideas that society is structured around power and structured by language and the extreme social constructionist ideas. It's taking those and saying, well, society is racist because there is a history of discrimination and oppression, and therefore society has been constructed, our language has been constructed, our institutions have been constructed in this social constructionist framework to represent that that power dynamic. And it's the sort of the deconstructionist side of things says, well, we basically have to tear it all down and build something new, because it's going to forever be tainted by this social construction that happened in that time and is representative of that culture, which is how we get this sort of intertemporal nature to things, you know, where it continues. An institution now is inherently tainted by its what happened while that institution existed 100 years ago, because of when it was socially constructed. That's sort of the idea that underpins it, as far as I can tell. But then what you're describing reminds me of the turn from the second phase to the third phase, which is the reification, which is, you know, I doubt Ibram X. Kendi considers himself to be a postmodernist, and you get a number of the sort of critical theorists who deny the link to postmodernism, but are implementing its ideas very clearly and are heavily influenced by it. And so you get this turn from just the linguistic social constructionist deconstructions to then being like, well, the deconstructionist has to be turned into action, which is where you have to be anti-racist. It's not simply enough to not be part of the previous power structure, you have to be directly opposed to it. And then the term anti-racist becoming so widely used as to not be questioned when it's used in these trainings. You know, even people who are implementing anti-racist training, I would be reasonably confident that many of them aren't actually familiar with the work of people like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi and certainly not going to be familiar with. The further you go back, the less familiar they're going to be. You know, Kimberly Crenshaw, Bell Hooks, they maybe know, but I doubt they've read any of her work. And then if you go to Derrida and Foucault, you can trace it the whole way back, but people don't understand these ideas because it's just become increasingly accepted as. There's a great irony in this to me, which is that the claim is that language is everything. You know, everything is socially constructed via language, and language creates the framework in which we operate. And they are then creating an entire vocabulary that dictates the way we can think and interact. And so what they were initially being critical of has become one of their main tactics, as it were.
Yes.
Was that making sense?
It does. I was just, as you were saying that, I was thinking about this training workshop that we had in my place last year, and I made meticulous notes with various timestamps about the things that they said in there. So I'm quoting here that they, the speaker from the external body who came in to deliver this anti-racism workshop explained that they are drawing from, quote, Robin DiAngelo's idea of morality. So, and I added as there is in my own notes, so this is going to be good. And then in addition to the workshop video, we also were given a recommended reading list, and Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist was at the top of that list. So certainly some training, so-called training providers are aware of at least the most recent generation of writer, of scholar activists within this particular field, although yeah, it's an open question as to how aware they are of it, going back to the likes of Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. I have to say, as much as I have harbored a withering scorn for Michel Foucault for many years, I should say, I very recently read a little bit more about his personal background that has kind of evinced some sympathy from me for him, actually. I don't know if you've looked into him at all, but he grew up, obviously, in the first half of the 20th century in France, and he was a homosexual man, and I wasn't aware that he was actually quite socially isolated even when he went to university, and despite his academic success, he was very socially isolated. He had myriad mental health issues. Apparently he attempted suicide on a number of occasions, and I think the idea is that, you know, his own sort of inner turbulence was largely to do with the fact that homosexuality was such a moral and legal taboo at the time. And so on reflection, I've been thinking to myself, it's small wonder that this man, this troubled, brilliant but troubled man, should then reach conclusions that, you know, society's rules are somewhat arbitrary, you know, when he's fallen afoul of them through necessarily no fault of his own. And it's small wonder then that he would go on to write about things like how prisons and sanitariums are based only on power structures around who has power and who has not, and who gets to define what is acceptable and what isn't. So while I still deplore his ideas, I have a bit more of a sympathy for him than I would have anticipated having for him.
Well, I mean, we've sort of gone straight in with being critical of his manifestations in society, but these ideas in themselves are not without some value.
Yeah.
You know, I have no doubt. So one of the big sort of postmodernist questions is that everything is inherently interpreted through a subjective framework. You know, there's a massive skepticism of such a thing as objective truth. I do believe there's an objective truth.
I personally don't think this is the strongest point of postmodernism. I feel like this is an open goal to refute, but sorry, carry on. Because we might as well try to steel man the different points of it at this point.
But there is an inherent point that you come to when you think about how do we know stuff, where if you ask enough times, there is always going to be a dead end. You know, and there are many things that we've believed to be true in the past that we've then discovered not to be true. You know, people once believed the Earth was flat. People once believed the Earth was flat, and then
Planet studies activists probably believe the Earth is fat as well.
Yeah, it was a Freudian slip there. I'm thinking of fat studies. No, people believe the Earth was flat. You know, people believe that the sun spun around the Earth. Like there's all these things, and even something. I like to go back to this example very frequently, but you know, Newtonian physics was proven to be, in terms of mass attracting mass, was proven to be wrong by Einstein with his theory of general relativity. And we continue to use Newtonian physics because they're a good enough proxy and they're the equations are a lot easier to manage than using Einstein's theory of general relativity for everything, because that would just be impractically long-winded. But these things are have been held as objective truths at some point and have then been questioned. But I think that there was a good I think it was a quote from Steven Pinker actually that was countering this, which about Enlightenment thinking, where he was like, well, actually, no, it's not that scientists and Enlightenment thinkers are asserting an objective truth about the world, is that they are radically skeptical themselves, and therefore they try to disprove things and accept that what can't be disproven is probably the best approximation we have of truth. So I think that the solution to the problem the postmodernists are raising is already present in what they're criticizing, but I do have sympathy to their issue that, you know, like I remember as a kid, you know, very simple thought exercises of like staring at the sky and being like, how do I know that what I see as blue is actually blue, and how do I know that someone else is seeing the same blue and it's not two completely different visions of the world that we just believe are the same through our shared language. And so I can see how they came to that position and why they had to wrestle with it, but I don't think it's necessarily beneficial. And I think that what they failed to do is come up with any solution to that problem, whereas sort of the Enlightenment liberal thinkers have come up with the solution to that problem already.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think they're not original at all in putting their finger on the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty in the world and in what we know. This is such an unoriginal point as to be almost mundane, really. And it doesn't necessarily need to paralyze one into indecision or nihilism. So you've got thinkers, and, you know, I won't know all of them. There'll be many other examples, I'm sure, that date back even further. But you've got the likes of Voltaire, writing in the 18th century that doubt is not a pleasant condition, but certainty is absurd, and pointing to the fact that even certain things that we've taken as scientific fact have then been modified and adjusted. This always makes me think of the status of Pluto these days, because when I grew up, we were taught that Pluto's a planet, and last I checked, it's now a dwarf planet. It seems to kind of hover between categorizations, but anyway, Voltaire is one, another one, a great one I absolutely love, Francis Bacon, right? So Francis Bacon, scientist, philosopher, statesman from the 17th century. In 1620, he wrote the Novum Organum, so a little over 400 years ago now, and I freaking love this book because this treatise, I should say, because you can read it today in 2022, and so much of it you think, damn, that's really relevant for now. Damn, society's forgotten the importance of that. Damn, yeah. And so on. And something, right, I'll read out for you some of the aphorisms from this. So aphorism 10, the subtlety of nature is far beyond that of sense or of the understanding, so that the specious meditations, speculations, and theories of mankind are but a kind of insanity. Only there is no one to stand by and observe it. And so I think he said, Francis Bacon there, put his finger on it in a way that's, I would say, is more eloquent than the likes of Foucault and Derrida. But he doesn't stop there, whereas the postmodernists would, arrive then at the conclusion of, everything is just subjective. We can't really derive any greater meaning. He goes on in aphorism 24. He says, the subtlety of nature is greater many times over than the subtlety of argument. But axioms duly and orderly formed from particulars easily discover the way to new particulars, and thus render sciences active. And when he's using the word nature, he's not using it in the same kind of narrow sense that we often mean these days of the environment, of greenery. He's talking about the universe itself. He's talking about reality. And I think he makes a very pertinent point there when he says that the subtlety of nature, of reality, is greater many times over than the subtlety of people's conceptual models of that reality. You can think of something like Marxism and just how terribly it falls short of an actual modeling of the way that society and human behavior works. And so there is a deep appreciation going back centuries for the complexity of reality and the elusiveness of truth. David Hume is another one, a great British empiricist, talking about how custom is the great guide of human life, because we can't be completely and absolutely certain about what's going to happen tomorrow. Like, is the sun going to rise? Just because it has in all previous instances doesn't mean it will tomorrow necessarily. We function on a kind of best approximation of the truth, but that doesn't necessarily have to immobilize us in terms of what we do, and in thinking that there is no objective truth. And so I think the refutation is that yes, reality is complex. It is mind-bendingly, bewilderingly complex, and we are limited creatures. We have limitation built into us, even on a cellular level. Another tangent from Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, he talks about the foveal cells in the human eye. Do you remember that one? I find that such a fascinating fact. And I think that's such a great example, not only of how limited we are in terms of our perceptive faculties, but on a metaphorical level as well, for our ability to understand and focus on particular things at one time. I've spoken to history students about the foveal cells, and how this is a neat metaphor for how whenever you're doing any kind of historical research, you need to have limits on what is going to be in the scope of your research, and everything else is going to be peripheral, and you're going to have a less perfect understanding of it because you have to focus and you have to define, that scope. And so all of this means then it's not that there isn't an objective reality, it's just that we have to function imperfectly within that and accept the fact that we're not going to have an absolute understanding of it. But that doesn't mean that there is no objective reality or that we can't try to align ourselves towards it.
Yeah, and this, what you're speaking of now, just makes me appreciate the beauty of both the academy and the market when they are operating as they should do, because what they have effectively acknowledged, although I can already see as I'm formulating this in my mind that this could lead to the postmodernist idea that everything is socially constructed, and there is an element of truth in that. But what you do is you basically outsource the without outsource is probably the wrong word, but you make it a collective endeavor with many different inputs, and no one has an overall like an oversight of everything. And because no one can have an oversight of everything. And it reminds me so much of, I remember when I was reading Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell, he was talking about the issues of the market under the Soviet Union, where they basically had the government setting prices, and in their attempt for government to set prices, there's basically, how many products are on the market? There was significantly less then, but there's thousands. And it was like, you have a small department of people who are responsible for keeping track of how much is needed and how much is being sold of every single item in the marketplace, which means that by the time they're updating the prices for something, they're already months and months out of date. And so you would constantly end up with surpluses that were rotting in warehouses while people were starving elsewhere because no one had been able to adjust it in time, because it was beyond the computational power of a government department to manage that.
That's a great example. I like that.
And this is what, when the academy works well, this is what it should be striving towards. You do have issues with it, and part of the issue is what's detailed in this book, the ideological corruption, but that's because there exists a chain of trust, as it were, and this is how I envision the third phase, the reification taking place. It's that these ideas have just been referenced over and over and over again and have been built into all the scholarship to the point where people no longer question it, because they're like, well, if it's for the last 20 years this has been the case, then someone must have proven it somewhere. It must be considered fairly solid to be spoken of as truth in this way. So people accept it as truth, and then people continue on that cycle of it being presented as truth. And actually, when you look at it, I mean, even now we have the replication crisis that's affecting some of the social sciences, but more science in general in many ways, in part because there is better technologies and methods for testing things. So, with the STEM fields, there's inevitably going to be things that turn up as we discover that we couldn't measure them properly before. But also it's, experiments hadn't been repeated, and they'd been cycled through references over and over again, being cited, and then eventually the fact that they're not replicable and the fact that there was issues with their initial experiments is lost in this constant stream of citations and referencing. That means no one's actually questioning it, and then people are starting to question it, and they're going, we've got a big problem, because it turns out almost all our science is wrong.
Quick interlude there. There's a similar issue in history as well.
Yeah.
was a historian called E.H. Carr who wrote a book called What is History, and he touches upon a similar issue about distinguishing between facts and historical facts. You know, a fact being just something that happened in the past, and a historical fact being something that happened in the past that had historical significance. And he points to the same replication issue of certain things being taken as historical fact and being referenced repeatedly and becoming absorbed and taken as a given, and in an unquestioning way. So yeah, that happens in other disciplines too.
Well, I think with that, one of the classic examples, and this sort of bridges the gap between the two of them, is that book Roots. I can't remember the name of the author, but this Roots is a history book about slavery that is sort of the basis for most of the teaching around slavery, certainly in the American education system. And when questioned on it, the author, when questioned on some of the historical inaccuracies in it, the author said, "I wanted to give my people a good story to live by." And this is what happens when you go down the road of refuting the idea of objective knowledge, and because when you say there is only subjective knowledge, you automatically take truth off of its pedestal as a guiding principle, because truth no longer matters, because it's just subjectivity. And so you almost invariably, I would say, end up in a ends justify the means situation, where using language in a certain way because it's the morally right thing to do for your specific ideological aim is justified, because you're not beholden to the truth as you would be if there is such a thing.
That's very interesting, because I think I'm drawing a couple of dots in my head with that now. So from what you're saying there, would you say it's reasonable to assert that taking that ends justifies the means approach, and we can tinker with truth and with language because, you know, it's justified in the end? Would you say taking that attitude then leads to disaster, leads to bad outcomes inevitably?
Yeah. Well,
okay,
so go on.
This calls to mind probably my favorite quote from the Buddhist text of the Dhammapada, right? And it's just a short stanza. Okay, it says, "He who says what is not goes down the path of hell, and he who says he has not done what he knows well he has done, both in the end have to suffer, because both sinned against truth." I find that such a fascinating idea, that one can sin not against God necessarily or against other people, but against truth itself. And that doing this, that saying things, putting out lies into the universe, is a sin against truth, and that it will incur some sort of karmic retribution at some point further down the line. And I think there's a link there between that stanza and what you were just saying about adopting this approach of, you know, trying to doctor language and taking this attitude of the ends justifying the means, and being prepared to sin against truth in the name of a greater good, which then ends in disaster.
Well, I think this is a tangent I'm going to avoid going off on to any great length, because it probably goes far too far from what we're aiming at. It would be the original Greek use of the word sin. I would be missing the mark. But there is a Christian idea that God is truth, you know, and this is so. To distinguish between them is not an easy thing to do, but I don't want to go into a conversation at this particular point in time about what is God and what is truth.
I just want to say I think it's fascinating that you can go to a text which, if I'm correct, dates to like the 3rd century BCE and find refutations to postmodernism.
Yeah. Well, it's been a very powerful idea, the idea that the truth will set you free over time, you know, and I have this debate, to put it in practical terms. I've had this debate at work a number of times because I think that in social work we embrace a lot of ideological positions which are heavily influenced by critical social justice theory, a lot of ideological positions. And I've always said, you know, a significant part of our job is about solving problems. There is clearly an ethical domain to it, but there's an inherent ethical imperative because we believe that those problems being solved is better than those problems not being solved. But we're solving problems, and I've always said, if we're not conceptualizing the problem in the right way, how are we ever going to solve it? You know, how could I ever expect you to solve a mathematical equation if I give you the wrong numbers?
Yeah,
it's not possible. And to go back to the analogy with Newtonian physics, there are times where the wrong interpretation can be close enough to act as a proxy to get you to the right answer. But that's not going to happen that often, you know, like you are putting in an element of chance that you could potentially avoid if you had the correct formulation of it. And that's complicated and that's messy because people are complicated and people are messy, and you are competing with more factors than you can possibly comprehend as an individual, as we've already discussed. So I understand why these things happen, but it's heading for disaster, because if you know, the place where it's probably come up the most often is with my conflict with the feminist ideology that is very strongly held within social work and influences substantial amounts of policy and things like that, where I have seen in action and in training and other things this idea that the problem almost invariably lies with men. And so there's often presumptions of guilt. You know, we ignore, and we tend to focus on men as perpetrators and assume guilt on their part, when the reality is often far more blurry than that. And that's not me saying that men do not perpetrate horrible things, but it's saying it's a very complicated thing. And I often find myself saying, well, we don't know for sure that we've got 100% accurate version of what's happening here. How much damage could be done if we're basically like, this, you know, this father must be guilty. We should take action to reduce his contact with his children, or ensure that any contact he has with his children is overseen by other people and therefore limited by the amount of supervision that could be provided for that, and all this. And then that's our hypothesis. That's based on our hypothesis, based on an ideological position. The reality could easily be that the risk comes equally, if not majority, from the mother, and that we've just heard select amounts of information, because we've inevitably heard select amounts of information because we couldn't possibly hear all the information. And we're to the postmodernist issue again, everything is subjective. So we're hearing secondhand information from two people's subjective interpretations.
Yes.
The postmodernist issue with that would be, well, who are we to say either of them's right? They must both be true, even if they completely contradict each other. Or in the applied turn, you go, well, who was historically oppressed, therefore they must be the one who's right.
Yeah, it's that is a hell of a dilemma. How do you, in your work, begin to go about trying to untie that knot?
I always think information is power. The more information you can get, the better you can make decisions and the closer you're going to be able to approximate the truth.
Yes.
I'll make this sound far more robotic than it is in person. I try and balance probabilities and see if I can calculate what's the most likely. But that is subject to so many different biases within my own thought and things like that, that I adopt this approach. And I think this is possibly, well, this is a Socratic method, really, but I think it's possibly not adopted anywhere near as widely as it should be, where I basically come up with a hypothesis and then I do everything I can to prove it wrong. I'm like, what evidence that I have would prove my hypothesis to be wrong? And I spend some time doing that. And basically, whatever I'm left standing with at the end is my best guess at what's happened. And it comes down ultimately to a signal detection theory issue. You are going to get so many false positives and so many false negatives. You have to figure out what the hit detection rate you are looking for is and try and adjust the system according to that. If you adjust it to be more cautious about not getting it wrong, then you run less risk of getting false positives and taking action where it's not needed, but you also run a bigger risk of missing something important and a child coming to significant harm as a result. If you make it less cautious, then you are going to be persecuting people where it's unwarranted. And so you're always trying to test that, and you always have to be questioning yourself and trying to prove yourself wrong. But I see that as the fundamental ethical imperative that each of us is under, is the need to try and prove ourselves wrong when making decisions about other people's life.
That element of humility, of epistemic humility, is also a very, very old idea, and is one you can see reflected in the comments of philosophers going back over the centuries. And it's almost a lost art really now, isn't it? It does feel like there needs to be more appreciation for it. Stephen Fry mentioned that in his monk debate alongside Jordan Peterson a few years ago, about how he wishes that every individual would take on a healthy amount of doubt. Yeah, so whereas it's really useful that you are in your position taking that approach with it, it would pay dividends if all of the colleagues around you were doing the exact same thing. Well, but sadly, they're probably not.
There definitely are some, and there are some who are very rigid about needing evidence for things. There are some who are probably overly confident. There are some who have their humility is misplaced. They will worry about they will sit anxiously and worry about their ability to strike up a conversation with someone and to obtain the information they need, but they will worry less about whether the decision is right, if you know what I mean. So they won't question themselves on how they're interpreting the evidence, but they will doubt themselves on their abilities. So it's a complicated thing, and I definitely don't want to present myself as, the sole bastion of Socratic thinking in the social work world or anything like that. I think it's something that's sorely lacking from the educational side of social work.
But maybe you need to put together a conference paper for a social work conference along these lines.
Perhaps. Maybe in a few years when I've got a bit more time.
On a vaguely related note, and still in the spirit of trying to steelman postmodernism, there is another knot here which I've never taken the time to sit down and try to unpick myself. But on the subject of lived experiences and the subjectivity around that, and of multiple truths, there was a French philosopher in the first half of the 20th century called Henri Bergson, who devised this concept he called vitalism. And it's this idea that direct experience of something is what leads to proper knowledge about it. And a really simple example of this would be something like looking at photos of Paris or some short descriptions or fact files about Paris, as opposed to actually going to the place itself and seeing it and being there and walking along its streets, and that kind of direct, immediate, first-hand experience being a way to properly know something. And there's an element of truth in what he's driving at, because we can appreciate that there is quite a difference between theoretically knowing something and having practical first-hand experience. This is definitely true for professions like yours and mine, for instance, isn't there? So on the one hand, we can appreciate that there's some validity to that, but on the other hand, that also looks like it could be used by critical social justice activists as an argument for putting forward this rhetoric about lived experiences and multiple truths. So how do we square that?
Well, I think of it as sort of like the difference between quantitative and qualitative research, and one of my big criticisms of social work academia is there's a massive lack of quantitative research. It's all qualitative. And I think, to me, there's a question of resolution. When you have quantitative data, it shows you things that are far more accurate, but on a broad, more universal scale, I guess. It gives you patterns and proclivities and what you expect. So it gives you something concrete. It lays a foundation for you. And then the qualitative data gives you that extra bit of definition. It shades in the colors, lets you see the texture, and lets you experience the sort of extra detail that you lack from a chart of numbers. I can see that people behave a certain way on average when I read a large data set, but I cannot tell what it is like to make those decisions, or what people are actually thinking when they're making those decisions, or what the experience of making those decisions is, without speaking to those people. But I've also said this a number of times when I've been speaking about different things, who a woman might have more experience. Actually, I'm going to play it safe. A man might have more experience of being himself as a man. But would I be able to say as a man that I definitively know more about men than a woman who's committed her entire career to studying men and their behavior?
Interesting.
And the probability is that I have a very limited sample set, and I have all my idiosyncrasies and biases that I'm interpreting myself through, whereas she has a much larger data set that's hopefully more objective, depending where she's coming from. And she will have been able to get a lot more insights as to what it's like to be a man in general compared to what I would be.
That's a very interesting example. I think that's very illustrative. I like that.
Well, this is one of the confusing things that you see happen in within these postmodernist theories is where they interchangeably decide that someone can speak on behalf of a group or not speak on behalf of a group. You know, when they want to berate you, you're doing something negative on behalf of your group. When they want to praise you, it's in spite of your group and it's not representative of your group. Just like, you know, they will raise up people who agree with them, like say a black person who agrees with critical race theory. They will herald them as representative of black people in general. Then if you get a Thomas Sowell or a Coleman Hughes or a John McWhorter or a Glenn Lowry, they're not representative of, sorry?
Larry Elder.
Larry Elder, yeah, they're not representative because they're not adhering to the majority narrative that's presumed to represent black people regardless of their group identity. And so there's an inherent contradiction in it. And we had it in Nottinghamshire, we had it not that long ago. There was an article in the local Post with a Conservative candidate who was a black man, basically saying that he'd had nothing but abuse from people on the left, calling him a coconut and things like that because he was a Conservative. Yeah. And I was like, fair play for the fact that he's actually in the media saying, you know, this is actually quite racist, right? Yeah. And it's such a weird dynamic. And I can already picture it were if anyone of this critical social justice leaning is listening to this conversation, that I would be accused of tokenizing that half a dozen black men that we spoke about who speak out against this. Chloe Balderi is another one. Just to get a woman in there and protect myself. And I would be accused of tokenizing these people and said, oh, they don't represent it. And who am I to, you know, I'm just picking people who suit the white narrative and things like that. And it's so
disingenuous.
Yeah. And just bereft of any substance. You know, it's just, it is. I can't think of any other way to describe it other than neo-racism. You know, you are, when it is convenient, you are a representative of your group identity all the time, apart from when it is inconvenient for you to be so, and you will be judged by the color of your skin, by your sex, by your sexuality, and it just disheartens me. I'm actually feeling upset about it now. It disheartens me that so much time and effort has been committed over the years to trying to make things more okay for people to be who they are and to be seen as an individual. And we're now in a position where people are being judged by their group characteristics again, and we're going backwards.
Yeah, it's again, cantankerous old soul that I am. I feel like this is a sign of civilizational decline, of cultural decadence. But leading on from what you were saying there, actually, I've got an example here from my so-called anti-racism, so-called training workshop. Okay, this is what I found to be one of the most egregious things that was said by the speaker in this workshop. Okay, so bear in mind, right, this is how incoherent all of this rhetoric is. In a separate part of the workshop, they include comments from people of Black or South Asian heritage talking about how they don't like the fact that people make assumptions about them because of their racial background, and they just want to be treated as individuals. Okay, so on the one hand, it says that in the workshop, they're putting forward that message. And then elsewhere, you've got this, right? I've put it down here as 43 minutes, 52 seconds in. And I quote, the speaker says, by not acknowledging that we see it, referring to colour, you're denying a person's lived experiences. You're denying their needs, their opportunities, their thoughts, their feelings, their identity. Now, in my notes, my comments underneath quotes, I've put here, what the fuck does this even mean? Because on the surface of it, there isn't a logic to it. It's just a load of treacle. It's this kind of guilting treacle. It's meant to sound like, I've got to reconsider how I deal with people. Then I don't want to hurt, deny people's needs, their feelings, or their identity. But really, how? There was no explanation for this, I should add, okay? Either before or after this comment was made, there was no explanation for how this actually lines up logically. How is it that by saying that we try to treat people in a colorblind way, figuratively colorblind, you're denying a person's lived experiences, denying their needs, their opportunities, their thoughts, their feelings, their identity? How does that even work? It scrambled my brain. I think I've discovered a kind of logic to explain it, right? I think this statement holds up on a logical level if you prioritize group identity, racial identity over everything else. I think that's the only way that comment makes sense. But then if you try to ignore a person's racial background, that leads to denying their lived experiences, their opportunities, thoughts, needs, and identity. All of these words that are put along and listed with it, all of these things are being tied to a person's racial background. And it's such a disgusting thing when you really try to pick at it and get at the logic behind it. And yeah, it's just that the low resolution thinking involved in this, in saying something like this, that sounds so empty. You've referred to that earlier in this conversation about how superficial so much of this is. And yeah, that for me was such a real brain twitch moment.
Yeah, well, I think to some degree, because I've actually got a very analogous story in some ways, but I think that it does have to give group identity primacy, because what it's effectively saying is that that sentence literally implies that their entire identity is dependent on them being seen by their racial identity. But it comes to what was discussed in the book again in terms of the subjectivity, what is often called different ways of knowing. And different ways of knowing is usually used to signify alternatives to science, and it includes things like feelings and superstitions and beliefs. And it is not by just accepting that statement that you read out, what is being denied is the significance of their individual biases and the flaws in their subjectivity. And I had this.
The irony is that statement itself is denying their lived experience and their need and so on.
You go on a treadmill with this, where it's oh, you're denying my lived experience by doing this. Well, you doing that is denying my lived experience. Well, you doing that about this is, and you can go on and on and on, you know. And I was in uni in a lecture for my diversity module, which was the pinnacle.
You really had to grind that sentence out.
Well, yeah, it's not an experience I like to relive if I can avoid. But we were given some reading to do before a lecture, and the lecture was an article by the British Association of Social Workers, or BASWA. And this article said that people on their so when you qualify as a social worker, you do a year of supervised practice before you're a full social worker as such, and that's called your ASYE year, but I can't remember exactly what ASYE stands for, so you're just going to have to accept the acronym for now. But it was saying that black students have been discriminated against on their ASYE, and the justification they gave for this was that they had 4 people they were supporting who were having issues with their ASYE, and 3 of them were black. I was like, okay, but that in itself doesn't tell us anything, because that's 4 people out of how many newly qualified social workers, and you know, there's a million different variables that could result in that. And this is just a classic example of that low resolution thinking. There is only a few dimensions by which anything can ever be analysed, and the only variable that matters in this case is race. And the evidence, there was no evidence in this article whatsoever, but it was saying they felt like they were being more harshly treated for not getting their work done, and things like, they felt they were being unduly criticised. And my lecturer asked what we thought of the article, and I said, well, where's the evidence? I can't really make a judgment on it without any evidence. And she said, what do you mean evidence? And I said, well, there's nothing in there that shows they were being discriminated against other than them feeling like they were being unfairly criticised. And most people's intuitive reaction to being criticised is to feel like they're being unfairly criticised. It's not a pleasant experience. It takes quite a lot to take that well without having, and even the most humble of people usually will have some twinge in their stomach that goes, this isn't nice, when they're being criticised, even if they then accept it. And I explained this, and the response I got was, you can only have these opinions because you're white, followed by her saying to the entire class, I would be really concerned if any of you became social workers without believing this. And inevitably, the people in the room aren't stupid. They were well aware of the fact that was very specifically targeted at me, because I'm the only one who's questioned it. And it's not like I've questioned it and gone, no, I don't believe it, they're just playing the race card. I haven't done anything like that. I've just said I can't make an assessment without evidence. But yeah, so that to me, it was just one of the most crystal clear examples of how intellectually vacant this whole thing is. But it's that thing of they feel discriminated against, therefore they are discriminated against.
I've got one for you from education this time, right? This one is by a scholar, David Gilbourne, who I believe is still active at Birmingham University. It's an article in Qualitative Inquiry from 2015, volume 21, about intersectionality, critical race theory, and the primacy of racism, race, class, gender, and disability in education. And in this article, he talks about how they surveyed a set of parents mostly middle class black parents, mostly based in the Greater London area. And I can't remember the number of interviews he said they did now. I think it was something like 60 odd interviews, and with 15 of them, they did follow-up interviews. And then he quotes from 6 of them in this article, okay, about these parents' experiences of dealing with their child's school and the kind of negative experiences that some of them have had in dealing with their child's school. And as part of the conclusion, he takes it as a given. Let me find the quote. He takes it as a given then, based on the quotes from these parents, from these selected quotes from these interviews, that it is not the needs of the black child, capital B of course, that are being served, but the interests of an institutionally racist education system. Really? Really, Rob?
Yeah.
We're going to say that the entire British education system is institutionally racist, based on some selected quotes from interviews with 6 black parents, largely based out of Greater London. Okay, that's interesting.
Have you were you aware of Tony Sewell's
reports?
With the reports, the race report, that he was commissioned by the government, and I listened to him speak about it. But basically, this is a black man who was commissioned by the government to do a report on institutional racism in the UK, and he worked with 7 other people, 6 of which were from ethnic minority backgrounds. There's 1 white person out of 8 in total. And I hate the fact I hate the fact that I'm having to put that justification in there, that I'm having to consider what ethnicity people are before to somehow justify the validity of their findings.
This is what we've come to.
It's so anyway. And they found no evidence of institutional racism in the UK. They said there are disparities, and they made some fairly significant recommendations for how to address them. But one of the things that they found in education was that while black children as a whole, if compared to white children, were performing worse, black Caribbean children were performing much worse than white children. White children were performing worse than black Africans. And they said, so the issue isn't race here, it's something else. Because you have to, once you divide it down to a higher resolution, and that's it. When you actually get into the details, you find that it's very different from what you assume when you look at it from a distance with select information. And there was widespread backlash to this. And one of the things that I saw happen.
Some people that I know, because of my workplace, refer to it as the sewer report. Sorry, Karen.
Well, one of the backlashes I saw and heard from people was them saying, of course, this is what they found. It's made to suit the government. I was like, well, it's not made to suit the government, because the recommendations are pretty hard for the government to implement. They weren't easy on the government. They're independent. And 3, people were presuming the findings before the evidence was looked at. And that was the people were like, I believe that there is institutional racism, therefore it doesn't matter if the report does not agree with me, the report is therefore wrong, rather than anything else. But he had an honorary degree at the University of Nottingham, not the university I go to, but the other local one. Yeah. And he had it revoked, not because they found any issue with the report and its findings, but because it was too controversial.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I just
Whereas they've kept the honorary degree of somebody else who's far more controversial, haven't they? I can't remember who it was precisely. I think it was it a diplomat from the Chinese Communist Party who they've kept, something like this?
I'm not sure. I hadn't heard of that. I was only aware of Tony Sewell's report and his honorary degree being revoked. But it makes me despair for what hope do we have of improve. It goes back to my thing of, if you've got the wrong numbers, you can't find the right answer in any equation. If we're no longer able to explore what the situation actually is, and we're not able to come to conclusions that aren't already predetermined, then we are never going to be able to resolve any of these problems, because we're going to forever fail to define them. And that's a very overt example, and there are many, many, many more lesser known ones. I mean, another big one, it's mentioned in the book, that is still a very overt, but probably less so in the UK situation, was Evergreen with Brett Weinstein.
I've seen the documentary for that.
No, I haven't.
There's a 3-part documentary on YouTube. I'll send you the links for it. It's fascinating to watch.
Okay, I'll if you post, yeah, I might link them in the description for this whenever I get it out as well. Absolutely. But for people who aren't familiar with it, there is a day of absence at Evergreen every year, where the black staff and students don't come into the university so that they can show how significant they are to the daily running of things. And it was one year suggested that rather than having a day of absence in that way, what they should, because that was black people losing out on a day's education, they should mandate that white people do not come onto campus that day. And Brett Weinstein, who is pretty liberal generally, he said that he was concerned by this because there's a difference between people choosing to not attend to make a point and people being forced not to attend because of their ethnicity. And he was then basically held hostage by students and chased down by people with baseball bats, and then lost his job over it and had to sue the university for their failure to act to protect him. And, there are loads and loads of situations and examples that I can think of, not even just limited to the university, but in society, where it's so much like 1984 by George Orwell and the concept of wrongthink. There is a orthodox set of views which are allowed, and if you contradict that, you have committed wrongthink and you will be punished. And it's, the term Orwellian is a term about dystopia and something we should be frightened of, and has been for a very long time. And it's because he did such a brilliant job of illustrating a terrifying future where we have all these over-the-top restrictions, and yet life is imitating art. And it was a piece of art that was imitating life because he was heavily influenced by sort of different trends that he saw. He was very critical of the Soviet Union, for example. But now it seems like we've got life imitating art in that regard.
Yeah, it's certainly a part of human nature, and something that's been observed many, many times through history. You talking about this now, in fact, before I say that, I'll just to loop back round briefly, you were talking about people taking it as a given that society is just structurally racist and therefore dismissing anything out of hand that might contradict that. Or on the flip side of it, they take even a really poor evidence base, like in that Gilborn article, and say, see, therefore, structural racism. Because for them, like you touched upon, it's a priori knowledge. They take it as a given, and therefore it doesn't matter if the evidence that they present for it is so shambolic, because for them it's a truth anyway, and they were going to find that in any case before they even set out on the research project. But yes, this issue about truth is something that goes back through the ages. Just either earlier today or yesterday, I was looking again at some of my notes from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, in which he talks about free speech, and he talks about an individual freedom, and he talks about issues regarding truth. And it's very interesting because he talks about he says, some people might say that, truth will always come forth just naturally because it's the truth. And he refutes this and says, well, actually, no, people aren't more zealous for the truth than they are for falsehoods. In fact, they're often more zealous for the falsehoods than they are for the truth. And that it's not the case that the truth will just naturally emerge when it's needed because of its inherent value. He says instead that the real advantage of the truth is that it can be ignored or suppressed once, twice, 3 times across the ages, but over the longer term, it will always be rediscovered. So it's almost a white pill for the long term, I suppose, but it does have some bleak implications for the present.
Well, it has it just has little intimations of the allegory of the cave by Plato. It's like, no matter how much of your life you spend in the cave, the outside world still exists outside of it. Even if you don't believe it does, it's still there.
And you can go out and see it for yourself and then come back in and try to enlighten other people, and they'll still cling to the cave.
Yeah. It's I don't know. I still have a degree. I still have faith that it is reversible and that things can be redeemed. And I think did you read you read the book, so presumably you did, the recommendations that they sort of made at the end, what they felt was the path forward?
Well, yeah, I've got some thoughts about the conclusion of the book, because I did find that very interesting. They do have this sort of mission statement, don't they? Principled opposition, this section here, which is very good. It's very useful. And I think for people who are worried about this, and for whom it's relatively new, but who are worried about it and who might want to try to speak openly in opposition to it in a principled and compassionate and liberal way, this will be tremendously useful. Before I read the book, I came across sort of similar materials from Counterweight's own website, and I put together my own kind of principled opposition document last year, actually, that takes some of these kind of sentences and framings. That, I think, is great. I did find it really interesting reading the conclusion now in 2022. What did I say about this? Yeah, I said the conclusion sort of made me feel by turns skeptical and ashamed. And I said ashamed because it made me wonder if this year and last year I should have been more outspoken in my workplace about the kind of attitudes being put forward around so-called anti-racism. And I said skeptical because I found it interesting reading this in 2022, when it was published in 2018, because I personally feel like it's harder to share the kind of optimism and perhaps innocence that is there in the conclusion about the possibility of reversing things. And I know since then, well, I don't want to kind of state anything that's incorrect about, Helen's position, what she's up to now, but I'm vaguely aware that she wanted to take a step back from things in relatively recent times due to just how overwhelming this problem is for society and how many examples of it were manifesting and how difficult it is to kind of try to push back against it. And so I wonder...
She tried to bear a very heavy cross.
Yeah, definitely. And so I wonder now if James and Helen were to write the book again, or at least the conclusion again in 2022, would they change? Would that same optimistic tone be there, or to the same extent? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's to me, it's a question of belief. It's a question of faith, I guess. My rational and pragmatic analysis of the situation can go both ways. I can see a route back to more liberal values and less of the illiberal authoritarianism, and to better scholarship. And I see things like, I read what's his name? I think it's Ritchie. Where is it? Stuart Ritchie. I read his Science Fictions, which is a book all about the issues within the academy, and he was that the fact that things like that are being published is very positive. And you've got organizations, you've still got Counterweight. There's another one starting up that I can't remember the name of, that I heard of recently. You've got Heterodox Academy that are doing really great work there. And I read authors like, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, The Coddling of the American Mind, which is a brilliant book, which makes the case for this being an issue from a psychological perspective and the impact it's having on people's mental health. I've read Campbell and Manning, The Rise of Victimhood Culture, which is a sociological text about this. So there are books coming out that are describing this phenomena as it happens and pushing back on it. And there's a lot of things out there. So I can see, but I also I can see a route forward and a route and reasons to be optimistic. I can also see, people getting cancelled. I can see nuance being stripped out of everything. I can see the endless march of the sort of diversity, inclusion, and equity initiatives. I can see all these things, but then, I guess before I go on to that, so I can make what I think is a rational case for both potential outcomes, and there are probably a million different degrees to which each of those could be true, and we'll end up somewhere in the middle, because the truth is always somewhere in the middle, I find. But I just stick to that belief as a matter of faith that the truth will set you free, and I think there are definitely
strikes again. Truth and utility are here the same thing.
Yeah. I feel a duty, I feel a sense of duty in all of this, and it can be, I haven't had to deal with it on anywhere near the degree of people like Pluckrose or Lindsay, but I have had my own encounters which have been challenging, where I've tried to challenge this, and I just keep on saying, if I speak truthfully and raise my concerns and deal with whatever comes my way, then hopefully I'll be able to contribute to things getting better. And whatever, and then from there, it's let the cards fall as they may. But one of the things that really concerns me, but also gives me hope in terms of the pushback that's coming on it, is the implication of, not implication, application of queer theory in society, in terms of the trend with gender questioning children, particularly. You know, that is probably, I think for many people, that is the area of most concern, where the negative impact is most clearly being seen.
I will say on that particular point, I do feel more optimistic, though, because it's also an area where I think you're right. It's probably the area of most concern for people, but also the area of most pushback as well.
Yeah, and that's why I sort of brought it up, is because I see, you know, things like the Tavistock clinic is being shut down. Yeah. Mermaids are in the hot water at the moment in the public eye. Loads of organisations have dropped Stonewall. And so I can see progress being made on one front. And hopefully that momentum helps the pushback, you know, because the idea is the linkages between these different ideas and the different form, you know, the different branches of postmodernist thought as it's spread out into wider society. It's intuitive to see that there's a link there in some ways, because the framework's so similar in how they look at the world. So that area in particular gives me cause for hope.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting you talking about that. It made me think of, this is going to seem random, right? But it made me think of Norse mythology.
Yeah.
I fucking love Norse mythology.
Me too.
And do you?
I suspect you're far better read in it than me, but
you know, it's been a long time since I last read about it in detail. But yeah, it's there's more philosophical sophistication there than most people are aware of. Especially when people think about the Vikings and just think about raging and pillaging berserkers. You know, but there are some really, really profound observations about the world and about human nature in it. And the thing that this makes me think of in particular is Ragnarök, the doom of the gods, the final battle, the kind of apocalypse. And in that, you have the forces of the Aesir, of the gods, you know, with all of these enemies arrayed against them. They've got the giants of Jotunheim, they've got the fire giants from Muspelheim, they've got the armies of the dead coming for them, the world serpent from the sea attacks as well. They've got all of these forces arrayed to destroy the world, literally destroy the world and destroy them. And it's a doomed battle. They know that it's unwinnable. Odin at least knows that it's unwinnable. And they still mount an opposition against it. They still try, even though it seems so bleak, even though it seems hopeless. They still try. And I think there's a really interesting ethic to take from that as well. That even if something seems insurmountable, even if the problems are there and the situation seems so bleak, it's still worth doing the right thing because it's the right thing. there's an ethic there of courage and principled opposition, even in the face of something that's inevitable. And I find that really quite motivating and quite encouraging, actually. Whether I'm thinking about just my own personal conduct in my own life or about these wider societal movements.
Well, and people, that heroic myth is admired by people all over the world over and over again. How many different iterations of that have we seen in movies and in TV and in songs and poems and stories? People really cling to that idea and admire that idea and see it as something to try and replicate in their life, the idea of standing up and doing the right thing even when the odds are against you.
Yeah.
And that to me is predicated on a faith that the thing you're doing is right, and that's why I feel like faith is necessary to continue on. But I think, psychologically speaking, I think faith is a prerequisite to action in any case. But that's another tangent. I feel like that's quite a positive place to end it, unless you had anything significant.
I would say so. I mean, there are myriad threads, aren't there, that we could spend hours pursuing, but I think, like you, that is a nice place to finish things off.